Previously on the war that came early.
Consequently, this country is at war with Germany.
Fact that men who will not fight for liberty can lose it. We too have faced that fact.
Herr Göring, the news came in. Your wife is pregnant and Stalin is the father.
And now, the thrilling conclusion. Well, it's been quite a while since I've talked about a work of Harry Turtledove, and just like the past couple of times I've done so, this is a part of a collaboration with the Alternate History Hub, who has already made a part 1. So I'd watch that video first so you can understand the basic premise of the story and what happens in the first 3 books. Also, just like previous collaborations, a lot of Turtledove books focus on characters, and we won't necessarily be spoiling those plot lines unless we absolutely have to. We're just talking about the general events of the alternate timeline that the books present. With all of that out of the way, let's get to the final 3 books of the 6-book series and see how this early World War II finishes. So after the really weird events of Book 3, we are in Book 4 now, and there's a really bizarre situation where, after deaths, diplomacy, and alliance switching, now the UK, France, and Nazi Germany are all teaming up to invade the Soviet Union, who had just made peace with Japan by giving them the area around Vladivostok after a short war there. The situation out west does seem more urgent now, after all, so it makes sense that they would do that. But this is still really weird. Again, this is why you need to see part 1 first. US President FDR, in his rage upon seeing the UK and France team up with the Germans, cuts off all aid, but is unable to send supplies to the Soviets to continue any Lend-Lease programs now. Regardless, this act actually helps him win a 3rd term for the presidency by keeping the United States out of the World War. But then, of course, with Russia out of the way, Japan now attacks the US and European colonial holdings in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. There is no Pearl Harbor, but the Philippines are, of course, still a target. Oh yeah, and the Spanish Civil War is still going on, with the Republican side still holding out. Now, where do we even begin with this situation? Well, as you can imagine, the idea of the UK now allied with Germany doesn't sit well with everyone. Prime Minister Horace Wilson skews more towards authoritarian measures to keep dissent quiet, which naturally makes everyone feel even worse about the situation. It wasn't enough to quiet everyone, and several MPs end up organizing a coup d'etat with the army against the British government, leading to not only PM Wilson's arrest, but a withdrawal of the UK from invading Russia and the coalition, and the UK continuing its war with the Axis. Now, while there is a mentioned back and forth between the British and Italians in North Africa, the book weirdly doesn't explain very well how all of those British troops in Russia were just allowed to go home after the UK re-declared war on Germany. Wouldn't they all just immediately be attacked by everyone else? The book implies that most of them just go over to Russia's side of the front and help them there, but wouldn't that be a complete logistical nightmare? Also, it implies the coalition still makes its way to Moscow, but wouldn't a British withdrawal mess that up too? It's very weird. Meanwhile, Japan and the United States clash, with the US making the occasional gain, but then being unable to sustain it because Japan, at the moment, has better air power. The US was also relieved to see the UK change its mind about the whole Axis thing, and began sending its supplies once again. Book 4 finally ends with France also changing its mind and rejoining the war against Germany. Okay, wait, hold on. I'm sorry, but what was the point of having a big switch of the United Kingdom and France siding with Germany, and then just changing their mind after invading deep into Russia a year later? Like, sure, the big switch was an original twist, I'll give it that, but it almost seems just wasted now. And there are more plot holes as it goes on. Why? And what do the next 2 books possibly have that can make this story still interesting instead of annoying? Oh yeah, I almost forgot. In Spain, Francisco Franco gets assassinated by a Czechoslovakian volunteer sniper. Okay, book, fine, I'll go with it. I really hope the 5th book is better. So the 5th book is actually the most boring book of the entire series, and it also covers the most amount of time in the European War, in which basically nothing happens. Germany focusing on a new Western Front yet again means they lose some ground in the Soviet Union, but that's really it in terms of shifting front lines. British and French soldiers that just randomly switched to helping the Soviets out were finally able to go back home to fight on the Western Front. Somehow. There are still hijinks in Africa as well, but that's really it. The only intriguing thing is British General Bernard Montgomery gets killed in action while fighting in Egypt. The Spanish Civil War is also at a numbing standstill. Still. The Pacific War, however, is slightly more interesting. Japan is now stretching to their limits as their larger gains in Vladivostok and China have ironically made it harder for them to expand eastward thanks to huge supply lines. For example, in the book, they literally drop bubonic plague-infested rats over Honolulu and Hawaii, which actually isn't that out there in theory, since Japan in reality did try to research these type of things with its infamous Unit 731. Either way, while the Japanese are able to take and hold Midway Island, they could not take Hawaii itself. Book 4 ended at the end of 1941, while this book ends in the spring of 1943, and somehow we've ended up basically in the same lineup of our World War II, except everything is much slower moving now. Book 6 being the final book of the series naturally means we learn how this war ends, for the most part. But with the war being a slow standstill, how does it end? Well, there's yet another coup, and this time it's in Germany. Hitler declares war on the United States in early 1944, and this ends up being the final event to convince the German army that Hitler is not able to win this war and they assassinate him. This kind of makes sense because, at least in our timeline, Germany had the illusion of superiority after beating France, and they were doing much better, so I can understand them forgiving Hitler's decision in our timeline to declare war in the United States. For Book 6, this new German government notably makes peace with the Allies, changes the flag to the Imperial German one, and in an ongoing persecution against the Jewish population, although I should note that the Holocaust hadn't reached the heights of the one in our timeline. With the peace, Germany remains undivided and armed, and keeps Austria and Czechoslovakia, the very thing that started this war in the first place. The Soviets, meanwhile, are able to keep the Baltic states and parts of northeastern Poland. Italy, which never got invaded, is still under Mussolini, but the book implies that his regime is very unstable. With this piece, there are several examples of irony compared to our timeline. For example, instead of Eastern Europe being a communist bloc, it's actually full of far-right dictatorships instead. The book also states that eventually the Republicans in Spain win the Civil War, so now you have a communist-influenced Spain, the inverse of our timeline. Meanwhile, the Soviets decide to join the United States in their war in the Pacific against Japan, mainly as revenge to retake Vladivostok. However, we don't see the conclusion of how this war goes, although it seems very doubtful the Japanese will be able to hold them off for too long. The final parts of the book then pose an interesting point where no nation has atomic weapons, nor a notable program for pursuing them, which worries Albert Einstein about the future. After all, the possibility of a full-scale World War III is still there, and now there's uncertainty on what'll happen with the knowledge of nuclear explosions out in the world, but no firm control by any nation. Thus ends Book 6 and therefore the series. Now, this whole book series from Turtle Dove gives me mixed feelings. A lot of it to me was confusing, perplexing, and kind of a letdown. Now, you might read these and legitimately enjoy the fictional characters, and that's great, but characters weren't what I ever got out of Turtle Dove books so much as the course of events. To me, the characters were vessels to explain those events and show their impact. So when the events are either confusingly implausible, like the big switch, or just boring, it makes me feel that it wasn't worth 6 whole books to tell this story. Now, what I do like about it is there are aspects of the butterfly effect in play. Like, yes, one small event could change everything, but this one seemed to involve a change that seemed minor, yet some of the major changes that happened because of it were more random. Like the fact that Francisco Franco, Bernard Montgomery, and Winston Churchill ended up dying in the series was an interesting butterfly example effect that I didn't expect and I kind of liked. It wasn't a butterfly effect causing the apocalypse like a bunch of dominoes, but rather a more plausible random change of events ending up a different way. Events like the big switch just seemed to me to be poorly written ways of making a scenario more interesting when the initial changes didn't seem to make it exciting enough. Then the final books just seemed like they were realizing how silly it was and then undid it as best as they could, so they ended up making a more confusing mess. It was the first and so far only Turtle Dove series to legitimately disappoint me, but hopefully you at least might get some enjoyment out of it. And I certainly hope you at least enjoyed the videos Alternate History Hub and I made about the books. I'm Emperor Tigerstar and I'll— Hey, wait a minute! You guys like maps, right? Of course you do, that's why you're here! And I bet you love older maps of Europe too. Well, I decided to make a whole bunch of things with accurate historical maps of Europe that I made. You want a mug with Napoleonic Europe on it? It's there. You want Dark Ages Europe, perhaps? You got it. You know what? Maybe you just want shower curtains showing the World War I map on it. Well, all of that is now available on my Redbubble, which I've linked in the description. It's a fun way to both support my channel and get a cool thing with a historical map on it, which, I mean, you can't find a better situation than that, right? So be sure to check my Redbubble out, and thank you so much for supporting the channel, and thanks for watching and subbing. I'll see you guys next time.